Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, president of Founding Forward. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's library hour, the first library hour at beautiful Founding Forward at our Valley Forge campus. Thank you. Can I ask, show of hands, how many first time on this campus? Yeah, and it's pretty nice, right? It's a wonderful historic site. We are sitting a mile from George Washington's headquarters. We are adjacent to Valley Forge National Park. And this is where it happens. This is where we bring students from across the country for immersive, historically based civic education from across the country. Every state in the country will send students to our programs this year. And it is a game changer. It's a game changer for them. It's a game changer for our teachers at Liberty Hill, which will start in a couple of weeks. Programs, 650, we hope, teachers in our programs this summer. And it's a game changer for our nation. We need this now more than ever. And as wonderful as this campus is, we need to make it bigger and better and nicer. And you'll see some, I hope you saw some renderings of what we have planned for this campus. It's going to be even better and again, even bigger. Our plans are to make this the civic education organization in the United States. And we need your help to do it. Without your support, it's not possible. So we look forward to that support. If you have given us a contribution, I thank you. I thank you. I will tell you we will use your investment wisely. If you have not yet made a contribution, you'll get an email tomorrow. And all you have to do is click on the thing that says, yes, I'll support your work. And we would really appreciate it. It's greatly needed. Lots more to come up here. We'll have a lot more programs in the weeks and months and years ahead. So tonight is pretty standard operating procedure, even though we're out in the burbs today, out in the country. We will have about a 40-minute presentation. We will have Q&A. We will be doing it with the mics, and you will keep it very short. It may have to be questions. And we have, I think we have books left over. Is that correct? A couple. So if you haven't gotten your book yet, there will be books afterwards as well. The program tonight will be introduced by one of our great leaders. And I want to mention one other before I introduce him, and it's our speaker committee chair. We are lucky to be blessed with some fantastic and generous leaders. I want to thank the chair of our speaker program committee, Mr. Paul Snitzer. Paul, thank you for your great work. Oh, one other housekeeping item. Please turn off your cell phones. I'm going to wait because last week we had a problem with that. While you do that, upcoming programs. Next Tuesday, Public Affairs Program, May 13th. Can a president do that? Analyzing executive orders with Jim Schultz and Mike McGinley. This one, you can't miss this one. It's going to be great. 27th, Public Affairs, examining Trump's policies, domestic affairs. And then June 2nd, Public Affairs, examining Trump's policies, foreign affairs. So the next three programs are public affairs. They are topical. They are important. They are all at the Union League House. So we look forward to seeing you there. Now, to introduce our program, one of our leaders, one of my bosses, member of the board of directors, the chair of the campus planning committee, a member of our strategic planning committee, all around great person. Please welcome Mr. John Nelson. John. Thanks, John.
Dr. Stephen Knott is Emeritus Professor of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and Thomas and Mabel Guy Professor of American History and Government at Ashland University. Knott was co-chair of the Presidential Oral History Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. His essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, Time, Politico, Foreign Policy, and more. He is author-editor of 10 books dealing with the American presidency, including Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, the Early Republic, and American Foreign Policy. His most recent book, Coming to Terms with John F. Kennedy, was published by the University Press of Kansas in October 2022. Founding Forward is honored to welcome our longtime friend and collaborator, historian Dr. Stephen Knott.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you coming out tonight on this beautiful evening. I'm glad the weather finally broke. So let me begin by, thanks, John. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about myself, and then we'll plunge into the presidency of John F. Kennedy. And I want to make sure we leave time for questions and answers. I don't want to just stand up here and talk at you. I'd rather engage in a conversation. I grew up in Massachusetts, and my mother was Irish Catholic, and John F. Kennedy to her might as well have been a saint. And I sort of absorbed that worshipful attitude towards President Kennedy as a young man. And by the way, I'm sure some of you who have Irish Catholic relatives, or perhaps Irish Catholic yourself, understand what this man meant to folks of that background, because he broke the glass ceiling that had kept any non-Protestant out of the White House for almost 200 years. So for somebody like my mother, from that point on, this man could do no wrong. And to add to that sort of personal connection for me, my first memory as a human being is of the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. I was 5 years old. My brother and I were wrestling in front of the television set in October of '62, and I looked up and I could see this look of fear on my parents' faces, and I had never seen that look before. And it was because they were listening to President Kennedy talk about the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and needless to say, this was probably the closest the United States and the Soviet Union came to World War III, and I will never forget that look of fear, and that is my earliest memory as a human being. My second earliest memory is about a year later, coming home from school, and my mother was seated in front of that same television where they had watched President Kennedy announce the Cuban Missile Crisis, and she was absorbing the news from Dallas, Texas. And that was the first time I ever saw my mother cry. And that made quite an impact on somebody who was 6 years old. So with these personal connections in mind, I should also add to it, my first job out of college was at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston. And I was there when the place opened, and I got to meet Jacqueline Kennedy and Caroline and John Kennedy, et cetera. And as far as my mother was concerned, landing that job, I might as well have been selected to be Pope. At that point, I could do no wrong, which was kind of a good position to be in. During my time at the Kennedy Library, I began to drift away somewhat from my worshipful take on President Kennedy. I saw some things that disturbed me a bit, particularly the family's penchant for trying to control history, giving access to historians who they knew would overlook certain things and denying it to others. As much as I admired President Kennedy, I was also devoted to the study of history, and that aspect of things turned me off. And so I drifted away for quite some time, actually, from that sort of youthful, worshipful take on President Kennedy. And I decided a few years ago it was time to go back and maybe take a more nuanced look at the first president I can remember, and someone who, to a great extent, was very much a part of my personal life. So what I'd like to do now is just walk you through some of the issues that I deal with in my book, now that I've given you that sort of personal take on President Kennedy. Starting with the election of 1960, controversial in itself, one of the closest in American history. Hopefully you can read those numbers. I apologize if the font is a little too small. Popular vote margin incredibly close. And in fact, to this day, a number of President Nixon supporters will contend that that popular vote was actually stolen by the Democratic Party in the state of Illinois in particular, Mayor Daley in Chicago. Nonetheless, Kennedy was elected. As you can see, the Electoral College vote was not especially narrow. A number of states carried pretty much even. But again, to this day, there is this perception in many quarters that the election of 1960 was stolen by the Democratic Party. I deal with this allegation in my book. There's one problem with that accusation, and that is that President Kennedy would have won the election of 1960 without the state of Illinois. He would still have won the Electoral College. And then you need to go and perhaps look at other states if you're going to try to contest this election. Richard Nixon, to his credit, at least publicly, did not attempt to contest the election and conceded to President Kennedy the next day. Now, one of the reasons for Kennedy's narrow victory was because of the 4 Kennedy-Nixon debates. You see that picture in the top right corner. Kennedy, on the first debate, was seen as the winner, at least in terms of being he was not as well known as Vice President Nixon. In a way, Kennedy had a steeper hill to climb, and he had to prove at 43 years old that he was up to the job. And most folks who watched it tended to conclude that at best for Nixon it was a draw, and perhaps at worst for Nixon, Kennedy had actually performed better. And I'm emphasizing this because Kennedy is really the first American president to use this new medium of television to great advantage. Dwight Eisenhower had held press conferences that were recorded for television, but then edited by the White House. When Kennedy becomes president, he's the first one to go live in front of the cameras. And that was a big hit at the time. These press conferences of John F. Kennedy attracted millions of viewers. And, let's face it, the guy looked like he had walked out of a Hollywood set. He had a full head of hair, something I've always been jealous of. Great smile. But added to that, and you see that both in the Kennedy-Nixon debate and in his press conferences, the 64 that he held throughout his brief presidency, the guy was really smart. I mean, he was incredibly quick. He was incredibly well-informed, well-read, did his homework, and that came through his use of television. So while you can make the case, and I point this out in my book, that there were certain superficial qualities that contributed to Kennedy's appeal, I would add that that's only half the story. That in fact, the man was a man of substance, a man who took the issues of his day quite seriously. Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1961, arguably President Kennedy's most famous speech. One of the shortest in American history, actually. I think only George Washington's second inaugural, and there's one other, I believe, that's slightly shorter, perhaps Jefferson. But I think there are certain memorable lines from this address that resonate to this day. I did want to point out this speech was written in collaboration with his speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen. And I'm pointing this out because another criticism leveled against President Kennedy is that Sorensen was really the mind behind this presidency. And while there's a strong case to be made that Sorensen was a great wordsmith, the collaboration, and I emphasize collaboration between Sorensen and John F. Kennedy, was one of equals. And Kennedy put a tremendous amount of effort into this speech and some of the other speeches that I will cite in a few minutes here. And one of the reasons I think John F. Kennedy continues to resonate in some quarters to this day is his mastery of rhetoric and his ability to inspire. And I would say only President Reagan in modern times, for many Americans, comes close to this, matching Kennedy's ability with words. All right, Now, looking at some specific issues, the foremost issue confronting President Kennedy and the United States during Kennedy's first year in office was the question of Berlin, the status of Berlin. Now, the Cold War is long over in our day, but in 1961, it was arguably at its peak. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader here, meeting with Kennedy in Vienna in June of '61, was threatening World War III if the United States, Great Britain, and France didn't pull out of West Berlin, thereby negating the post-war treaty that had been signed by the great powers. Kennedy refused to do that, that confrontation throughout 1961, there were points when people were convinced we were on the edge of World War III. It's in August of '61 when Khrushchev decides to build the Berlin Wall. So that occurs on Kennedy's watch. Some conservatives will criticize him for not taking action at that point to knock the wall down, but Kennedy was determined to avoid this situation from escalating. The picture on the right is JFK at the Berlin Wall, addressing the German people. Approximately 400,000 West Berliners showed up for this speech. This is the famous speech where he says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. I want to emphasize this point. That does not mean I am a Jolly Donut. That's a common conspiracy theory that's sort of spread on the internet. The 400,000 Germans who cheered that line knew exactly what he was saying. The source of that internet rumor that Kennedy was actually declaring himself a donut is a work of fiction. But it just shows you the deleterious effects of the internet these days, because that's become gospel in a lot of quarters. Now, another deeply controversial issue, and I have to point out, for us, this one's the bigger one, Vietnam. It was not so much in his day. It was Berlin, it was Cuba. Vietnam was not on the back burner, but it was not on the front of the stove either. And Kennedy, I think rightly so, is criticized for escalating American involvement in Vietnam. When Kennedy became president, there were approximately 700 or 800 American advisors in Vietnam from the Eisenhower years. By the time Kennedy is killed in Dallas, 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days after becoming president, we're up to about 17 or 18,000 advisors. So there was clearly an escalation in terms of American involvement in that role. Involvement in Vietnam. Now, I have to confess to you, I've turned 180 degrees. I used to be part of the school that believed that had Kennedy lived, he would have followed a similar course to President Johnson. I no longer believe that. And my book goes into great detail as to why I believe that, or no longer believe that. But my main reason is, and this is something I've learned in recent years, this was a man who hated war. He had been a bona fide hero of the Second World War. He remains our only president ever to receive the Purple Heart for wounds he suffered on the PT-109 incident in August of 1943. He won the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his service in the South Pacific. And 2 of his crew members were killed that night, that dark night in August of '43. He never forgot that. And you add to that the fact that his oldest brother was killed less than a year later in the European theater. This was a man who despised war. That's an aspect of Kennedy's life, Kennedy's presidency, that is not given enough weight. And I have just come to a fairly, I grant you it's speculation, but I think it's informed speculation. This is not a man who would have stood by while hundreds of thousands, 550,000 American troops were dispatched to Vietnam by 1968, and thousands of body bags were beginning to return to the United States by 1968. I don't see him following the same course of action. I'm happy to take some follow-up questions on that because I realize that's something of a controversial position. This is a direct quote from my book. Now, back to Cuba. Again, Cuba and Berlin for Kennedy were the top foreign policy crises of his administration. The bottom photograph there on the right is some of the Bay of Pigs veterans who were captured by Castro's government after the American-sponsored invasion of Cuba failed in April 1961. Kennedy had given the green light for this invasion, took responsibility for it, it was, let's face it, a fiasco. He spent the next year and a half trying to free those prisoners. The picture up top there is a ceremony in the Orange Bowl in Miami in December 1962, after the Castro government freed these prisoners in exchange for millions of dollars worth of American aid, a ransom payment. Now, it's interesting to note, after the Bay of Pigs, the United States, under President Kennedy, actually intensified its efforts to remove Castro. And what I'm referring to was a very secretive operation called Operation Mongoose that included an effort to assassinate Fidel Castro. And we could talk about Kennedy's assassination perhaps in a few minutes here, but those who believe that Kennedy was the victim of some conspiracy will often point to the fact that his government, under the direction of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was plotting to kill Fidel Castro. So that's going to be, and what I've just spoken to you about right now wasn't known by the American people at the time. And so when Kennedy makes this remark to those veterans, I can assure you that this flag, that's the brigade flag of the Bay of Pigs veterans, Brigade 2506. It was named after one of their fellow trainees who was killed in a training accident preparing for the invasion. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana. What we didn't know at the time was Operation Mongoose. All right, now, jumping ahead to October 1962, arguably, not even arguably, forget that, I would say categorically, the worst crisis of the Cold War era, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. This is a picture you see on the right. That's a photograph taken from a U-2 spy plane on the 23rd October 62 of a missile site, medium-range ballistic missile, under construction in San Cristobal, Cuba. These are the types of photographs that were shown to President Kennedy to show that the Soviets, despite repeated promises, were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. And of course, the speech that President Kennedy makes, telling the nation, telling the world that we had discovered these missile sites under construction, is the one that I remember as my first memory. And you had a very intense 13-day crisis where there was a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, President Kennedy demanding the removal of these missiles, the halt to the construction. You see a photograph here on the left. That's an American destroyer, an American aircraft, trailing a Soviet freighter that was believed to be carrying missile components for construction in Cuba. Now, at the last minute, the Soviet Union, in the words of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, blinked. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. World War III was averted, but what was not known at the time was that President Kennedy had also agreed to remove some American missiles from Turkey. That part was kept secret, and he also pledged not to invade Cuba. In other words, there would not be another Bay of Pigs. Now, what he did not confess to, in a sense, was Operation Mongoose, that we were still attempting to decapitate, as they put it, the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro. All right, switching gears, Kennedy and the race to the moon. This is a photograph of President Kennedy speaking on a very, very hot day at Rice University in Texas, Houston, Texas, September 12, 1962. I think Kennedy is the president most strongly identified with the American effort to land a man on the moon. You can see, hopefully you can read some of the excerpts from this speech. By the way, you can watch all these JFK speeches on YouTube. If you're interested in the man or the era, it's worth your time to take a look at these speeches. But this obviously was part of Kennedy's belief in the so-called new frontier. The United States was going to be on the cutting edge of exploring space. And Kennedy was determined to give the American people something to focus on beyond themselves, in a sense. While we were locked in a Cold War, but we were at peace, and he really felt there needed to be some sort of national endeavor that would serve to unify the American people and give them, again, something beyond themselves to literally shoot for. And I think as long as our republic survives, this will be, in my view, the accomplishment of Kennedy that will be most remembered. If this country, God willing, still exists in 100 or 200 years from now, I believe President Kennedy will still be remembered primarily for this goal. And it's important to realize when he lays out this goal, we couldn't do this. We lacked the technology to land a man on the moon. We could barely get off the launch pad in the early 1960s. So he was setting a very difficult goal for the United States to achieve, and we achieved it in under 10 years. Now, returning more towards the domestic agenda, and this is another controversial aspect of Kennedy's record. He's often criticized by American liberals, both then and now, for being too much of a bystander when it came to civil rights, not using the power of his office to press for the goals of Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders at the time. Others, and myself included, are more sympathetic to Kennedy's approach. I do believe you can argue that his time in government, his time in the White House, and Johnson's, of course, marked a second Reconstruction. Kennedy's speech of June 1963, in which he lays out the civil rights issue as a moral question, and he refers to the Declaration of Independence, the unfinished promise of the Declaration. He refers to a Western Judeo-Christian tradition. He refers to the Constitution. He refers to Abraham Lincoln. It's a remarkable speech, and it was a politically risky speech, because Kennedy had won the White House. If you can remember that map that I started off with, the road to the White House went, as Kennedy put it, through Dixie. And if he was going to win re-election in 1964, he needed enough Southern white Democrats to stay with him. And that speech of June of '63 is going to cost him support amongst these white Southern Democrats. In fact, his poll numbers are going to fall quite dramatically. And part of the reason he's in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963 is he's in trouble in the South. He needs a state like Texas, Florida. He'd been in Florida a week prior. He's in some trouble as the '64 election approaches. And that, again, is due to his administration, perhaps belatedly, being associated with the movement of Martin Luther King for equal justice under the law. By the way, this photograph was taken on the very day that King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy invited all the leaders back to the White House and spoke with each of them and congratulated each of them individually. One of the accomplishment that he was most proud of before his premature death was this nuclear test ban treaty that banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Some of you are old enough to remember, I am, when these things were exploded in the Nevada desert. and the radiation would be traveled, through the jet stream around the globe. The Russians were doing the same thing. This put a stop to that practice. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union decided not to test these weapons anymore in the atmosphere. You could argue it was a small step, but it was an important step. It really is the first one between the United States and the Soviet Union to be signed in quite some time. And I've got a quote here from a speech of his, another very famous speech, June 10th, 63, a commencement address at American University, in which Kennedy really lays out his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And he actually proposes that as a negotiating goal between the great powers. It is a remarkable speech. Again, another one, if you're interested in him or this era, that I would urge you to take a look at on YouTube. And he also spent quite a bit of political capital on this as well, because he was accused by a lot of conservatives, both in his party and the Republican Party, of giving away too much to the Soviet Union. Now, again, that brings us, so in the fall of 63, and I would argue Kennedy has finally really found his voice, both on civil rights and on détente with the Soviet Union. He's looking ahead. The election of 64 is less than a year away. He's looking ahead to what he thinks will be a pretty tough re-election campaign. Not sure who he's going to run against. Possibly Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, possibly Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. It's not clear, but he's in trouble in the South. And also the Texas Democratic Party is in disarray. And this trip was designed to both shore up Kennedy's standing within the party in Texas, and also to get these various political figures, including Vice President Johnson and Governor John Connally. He's the man seated right in front of President Kennedy there in the limo, to get them to sort of work with each other instead of feuding with each other. Now, by the way, interesting trivia, unfortunately, the individual right at the top there, he's holding on to the side of the follow-up car. That's Clint Hill, who was a Secret Service agent who within about 10 seconds here will be jumping onto the back of the president's limousine, grabbing that handle that you can see on the trunk, and trying to push Mrs. Kennedy back into the car and shield President Kennedy. Clint Hill just died 2 weeks ago at the age of 93. He spent 60 years regretting that he hadn't moved a couple seconds sooner. That might have made a difference. It might have. But this event, for those of us my age, the baby boom generation, this was our 9/11. This was a day that none of us of this age will ever forget. And as I said to you at the beginning of my talk, it's my second earliest memory. We can talk about the assassination if you wish. I have some strong opinions about it. I'm happy to address this controversial issue as well. Last thing I want to conclude on before we get to your questions. This was a poll taken by the Gallup organization in June of 2023, just a few months prior to to the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's murder. And I hope you can read these numbers. I apologize for the slide quality. Gallup, every few years, asks the American public to retrospectively rate the American presidents. And you can see John F. Kennedy routinely comes in first. And in 2023, his retrospective approval rating was at 90%. Bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans. And this is incredibly unique to have such a high approval rating. Again, the American public looking back on these presidents. Ronald Reagan coming in second at 69. No other contemporary American president has come anywhere close to this 90% approval. And I just want to conclude by saying, look, this was not Camelot. That was Jacqueline Kennedy's description given within a week of her husband's death. Clearly, that marriage was not a model marriage by any stretch. There were other, Operation Mongoose, et cetera, Bay of Pigs. But I think the reason JFK continues to capture the American imagination over 60 years is those rhetorical skills that I mentioned to you. I think his ability to inspire, his ability to ask the American people to go beyond themselves, to give something back to their country, I think that's part of the explanation why he's at 90%. Thank you for listening. Let's get to your question.
Steve, thank you for a great presentation. We have time for questions. Just raise your hand and we'll get to as many as we can. Kira, right here in the middle. Thank you.
Great presentation. In your book, you comment that when you worked at the library, that you got access to some recordings and files that no one had seen in a long time. But I wonder if you could share a moment where you said, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm seeing this.
Yeah. So now most of this stuff, so I was there from 79 to 85. It opened in 1979. A lot of this stuff has since come out. But at the time, it was closed. One of the things that really jumped out at me, and you can hear this on YouTube as well, it's now been released. President Kennedy went ballistic when he found out that an Air Force colonel, I think, up at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts, had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on baby furniture for the Kennedys' third child, who was due to arrive September or October. And the New York Times got onto this, that all this money was being spent to set up a special maternity ward at an Air Force base near the Kennedys' retirement home. And Kennedy uses every expletive in the book, ripping his Air Force General Godfrey McHugh, ripping him a new one, as they say. I hope that's not too crude, but just really letting this guy have it and using some words I hadn't heard in a long time. That one, and so for somebody who had this kind of saintly vision of that man, that was the end of that on that day when I heard that. He was upset about the optics of what it would look like, tax dollars being spent on a maternity ward for Jackie Kennedy.
Right over here, Kara.
Thank you for this presentation. It was great. I was in 9th grade industrial arts class when Kennedy was shot. And I remember it coming through. It was too old to have an intercom that the teacher said something. My question is, do you think that the 90% is due to the fact that if Kennedy was alive today, he'd be a Republican?
I missed the very last part.
I said, do you think that the 90% is certainly in part because if he were alive today, philosophically and politically, he'd be a Republican?
Well, I know a lot of Republicans believe that. There's some grounds for that in that Kennedy was very hawkish when it came towards the Soviet Union. At least the old Republican Party used to take a pretty hard line vis-a-vis, Reagan referred to them as the evil empire. There was a lot of Reagan rhetoric that John F. Kennedy would have easily uttered as well. So there's definitely that overlap, I think, in terms of those Republicans or conservatives, perhaps better put, who are hawkish on foreign policy and want to see the United States take an assertive role. The Republican Party is changing on that, let's face it. Where I thought you were going, that was a great question, but where I thought you were going was, had he not been killed, I'm sure we're not going to see 90%. That's definitely a factor. 43 years old, his beautiful wife right next to him. By the way, she never traveled with him on these domestic trips. This is one of the few. It was very rare for her to be with him. And there she is right next to him when he's murdered. Those images, you and I can remember, those are seared in our memory. And then 2 to 3 days later, little John Jr. saluting the casket. And it just, people of our age will never forget it. That's part of what this 90% is, part of it.
Jason in the back.
Thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
Could you comment on your views on Kennedy's relationship with Allen Dulles and the CIA.
Yeah, so Kennedy inherits, Kennedy keeps Eisenhower's foreign policy team to a certain extent in place, including CIA Director Allen Dulles. Kennedy could have replaced them, new administration, you can clean house. He chose not to. He keeps Dulles in place. He keeps a number of Eisenhower appointees in place. Kennedy, had campaigned very much on an anti-Castro platform. And Eisenhower tells him in the transition period, we have plans underway to try to overthrow the Castro government. And Kennedy's in agreement with this. Now he's going to change some of the details that Dulles and his people have come up with that will eventually be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. But Kennedy is fully supportive of the idea that Castro has to go. I mean, he repeatedly said in 1960, we've got this communist menace 90 miles off Key West. For the first time, the Soviets had broken through into the Americas, into the Western Hemisphere. They're violating the Monroe Doctrine. So Kennedy, Dulles, Eisenhower, there is a bipartisan consensus that something has to be done about Cuba. When the Bay of Pigs fails, Kennedy takes responsibility, but 6 months later, replaces Allen Dulles and a few other figures at the CIA. In a sense, they're fired for the screw-up at the Bay of Pigs. So it's a relationship. It's not a close relationship. Ideologically, they saw some things eye to eye. But as Kennedy put it to Dulles when he fired him, in a parliamentary system, I'd be the one gone. But in our system, you're gone. By the way, I don't believe the notion that Dulles and the CIA killed President Kennedy. I think that's absolute crazy.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on his relationship with Johnson and how that might have developed.
Yeah, so Lyndon Johnson was arguably one of Kennedy's chief rivals for the 1960 nomination. Johnson didn't campaign, but he was the majority leader of the Senate. A lot of folks assume he was the favorite of party leaders, not Kennedy. The only reason Kennedy got the nomination is he went out into the primaries and proved he could win votes. Johnson didn't even campaign, but when they go into the 60 convention at Los Angeles, Johnson is arguably his main opponent. And it's Johnson, by the way, who's going to raise some questions about Kennedy's health, which I didn't even touch on, and Kennedy's health was not good. He had Addison's disease, which at that time was occasionally a killer, and he denied it. So Johnson hits him on that. It's ugly for a time between those two men, but Kennedy, being a smart political figure, picks this rival from Texas to run with him. And by the way, I don't think Kennedy wins in 1960 without Johnson on the ticket. I think if Kennedy were here today, he'd say the same thing. Now, as vice president, Johnson is going to be sidelined, as many vice presidents are. It's not a happy time in Johnson's career. But I think there was some grudging admiration on JFK's part towards Lyndon Johnson. Just to give you some evidence for that, when some of Kennedy's advisors would criticize Johnson or make fun of him, he would say, look, you have no right to say anything about this man until you run for public office yourself someday. So Kennedy was one of these politicians who respected other politicians, and Lyndon Johnson was a master politician. Great question.
Thank you for the presentation. How would you describe Kennedy's relationship with his father in regards to his public life as well, to how much influence his dad had on that?
Yeah, I believe that there's a tendency to overestimate the old man, I should call him that, the father's influence on President Kennedy. There's no question he bankrolled his son's political campaigns and was able to recruit others to bankroll his campaigns as well. But there's a tendency, I think, to overestimate or overstate Joseph P. Kennedy's influence on President Kennedy. I mean, for one thing, Joseph P. Kennedy's going to have a stroke, a serious stroke, in December of '61. So for almost 2 years, President Kennedy's father is unable to speak, so he's not an influential figure on this presidency. Is he influential in terms of, again, bankrolling JFK's campaigns, perhaps urging him to go into public service? Sure, no question about it. But again, I do think there's a tendency to overstate Joseph's influence, his impact. Just one quick area on policy where they disagreed. John F. Kennedy was an internationalist. John F. Kennedy believed that the United States should lead abroad. The father did not. And I could list other policy areas where there were differences between the two. So important, yes. Influential, I think very much overstated. I hope that answers your question.
Question there in the back, Jason. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Is there any data in your mind about Oswald and everything that's tied with that?
Zero. And if you've ever been to the 6th floor museum in Dallas, here you had an ex-Marine. Well, I guess once a Marine, always whatever. But I've never fired a serious weapon in my life. I probably could have hit President Kennedy from that. I mean, he was a sitting duck. Now, so Oswald, we know, had taken a shot at a retired American general in April of '63. He missed, just barely. That gun was the same gun that's going to be found on the 6th floor of the school book depository in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald is the only employee to flee the building after the shooting, the only one. The night before the shooting, he had tried to reconcile with his wife, whom he was separated from. When that failed, he didn't tell her. She didn't find this until the next day. He took off his wedding ring, left her all the cash he had, and hid it in the desk drawer of the bedroom. So he knew what he was going to do the next day. When he travels into work the next day, a coworker gives him a lift. He's got a package with him like this. The coworker says to him, "What's in the bag, Lee?" He says, "Curtain rods." Now, I don't know about you, but when I go to work, I don't bring curtain rods with me. So, I mean, the evidence is that the palm print found on the rifle hidden on the 6th floor is Oswald's palm print. Now, we can go into crazy land and say somebody planted that there. I get it. And it doesn't help that he's going to be killed 2 days later by another assassin who many people believe were trying to silence Oswald. But in my view, the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald is overwhelming. And one of the things that saddens me about the internet, which I've already taken a shot at earlier about the jelly donut, is that it fosters these conspiracy theories that may seem to be of antiquated interest, but in fact what they do is undermine Americans' confidence in our system of government. And by the way, one of the leading advocates of this broader conspiracy theory was the Soviet Union and the KGB, because it's in their interest to undermine our faith in our government. So in my view, one other thing. Oswald kept two documents, a historic diary, he calls it. All right, he's a 24-year-old book warehouse guy keeping an historic diary, and a book of operations in which he outlined his secret world. This was a guy who lived in a fantasy world, wanted to make a mark on history, and succeeded.
Questions? Kira, right here in the front. Please, could you use the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about Kennedy and his choice with McNamara and the fact that Johnson kept him on and what we know now?
Yeah, so Robert McNamara was by all accounts, a Republican. Another example of Kennedy attempting to forge a bipartisan foreign policy team, not only with Allen Dulles, but with Robert McNamara. CEO of Ford Motor Company, somebody who was considered to be a kind of organizational genius. Kennedy wanted to bring a guy in who he thought could reform the Pentagon in a sense, and McNamara attempted to do that. Now, the thing we all associate McNamara with is the war in Vietnam. And he is a Kennedy appointee. Johnson keeps him in place, in part because after Kennedy is murdered, Johnson wants the Kennedy team to stay in place. And he talks about continuity, continuity, continuity. Most of those guys are going to leave by 1965. McNamara stays on close to the bitter end, I think 67 or 8. Yeah, I mean, you know, that quantitative organizational approach that may have worked at Ford Motor Company and may arguably have worked at the Defense Department did not work in the swamps of Vietnam. And to the extent that Kennedy brought him into the highest levels of the government, he deserves, you know, has to take responsibility for that. JFK admired McNamara, though. He absolutely admired him. McNamara said to him, Mr. President, why do you want me at the Department of Defense? I don't have any real government experience. And Kennedy said something effective, well, Bob, neither do I. Kennedy also admired the fact that McNamara agreed to take the position of Defense Secretary for $1 a year. He didn't need the money.
More questions? In the back there, Jason, thank you.
So could you speak a bit about his relationship with his brother and obviously appointing him as Attorney General? Because it seems to me that this, I'm trying to put this delicately, but has kind of set off a wish for a certain type of Attorney General amongst some other presidents.
Yeah, it was a controversial appointment at the time, and you know, to some extent to this day, this feeling, this the image of nepotism. I think personally there's a lot to admire in Robert Kennedy, but I totally get the concerns about putting your brother in a position where he might have to investigate executive branch abuses. And I think perhaps you were getting at this, you know, the chickens are coming home to roost on that, arguably. That's probably not a good practice to put a relative or a close associate in that very important position devoted to the rule of law. So I'm mildly critical of President Kennedy in regards to RFK. But again, it's tough because in a lot of ways, Robert Kennedy was, in my view, a model attorney general. And just to give you one example, there've always been these rumors, and I think many are without foundation, but of mob connections with the father, Joseph P. Kennedy, that the mob helped President Kennedy win the election in Chicago and perhaps in the West Virginia primary. But no attorney general has gone after organized crime more aggressively, even to this day, than Robert Kennedy. So if there was this kind of relationship, it doesn't make a lot of sense that this would be the most aggressive Justice Department to go after the mob ever. And the only other thing I'll mention about RFK, he's kind of slow to come around, but once the violent resistance to King and his movement begins, RFK, perhaps belatedly, but towards the end, is very aggressive in terms of trying to enforce the equal protection of the law for black Southerners who've never experienced that in their lives. So I admire that aspect about RFK as well. But I get your point. It perhaps was a troublesome precedent to appoint your brother to be the chief law enforcement officer. Great question.
Other questions? I'm sorry, if you use a microphone. Thank you.
I mean, this is the early part of the Vietnam War, but was Kennedy, was the American public aware of the ramp up, or was there a lot, yeah, because you can read that, you know, the whole thing was really kept secret, the number of troops, things like that. I'm just wondering your perspective.
Sure. If you were paying attention at that time, you would have known that this buildup was going on. But that would have meant that you would have had to have read the New York Times or the Washington Post. You would have had to pay attention. To the extent that Americans were paying attention to foreign policy, it was Berlin and Cuba. Again, to repeat. I think the notion that David Halberstam and some other journalists have pushed forward, that it was kind of a secret escalation, I think that's vastly overstated. If you wanted to know whether you were a private citizen or a member of Congress, you could know. If you weren't paying attention, that's on you. Again, let me reiterate, it's my view that President Kennedy was trying to kick the can on Vietnam past the '64 election. He thought the Republicans would beat the heck out of him if he pulled out of Vietnam prior to '64. And by the way, they would have. And he kicked the can down the road, for better or for worse. And I believe had he lived, as I made my case earlier, you're not going to see 500,000 American soldiers there by '68. But no, it's not a secret escalation.
I will take the liberty. Oh, you have one more there,
One more?
Peter? Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Doctor. Great job. What presidents, if any, did Kennedy admire?
Huh. Oh, that's great. He admired Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson was arguably the founder of Kennedy's party. And there's that great line, Kennedy hosted a dinner for all, in 1963, of all the American Nobel Prize winners, whether it was physics or chemistry or whatever. So there are about 50 or so of them there. And Kennedy uttered that great line that this was the greatest collection of talent ever assembled on the roof of the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And that's sort of a statement that shows Kennedy's high regard. And he would frequently talk about Jefferson as a kind of Renaissance man. Other presidents, you might think Franklin Roosevelt, but there was actually quite a bit of tension between the Kennedy and Roosevelt families. President Kennedy's father had served under Franklin Roosevelt. That did not end well. And I think the son, John F. Kennedy, had some memories of that. I do think Kennedy admired Abraham Lincoln, as I think most Americans do. And because Kennedy happened to serve during the centennial of the Civil War, he made a number of speeches referencing Lincoln. And by the way, Kennedy was interested in the Civil War, visited Gettysburg on more than one occasion, and I think some of the other Civil War battlefields. So I'd have to put Lincoln pretty high, Chris, on Kennedy's admiration list.
One final question from me.
Sure.
Papers released just recently at the end of March.
Yeah.
Anything we're going to learn or have learned from the release of the Kennedy assassination papers?
No, I don't. I mean, I've already made my position pretty clear, so there might be some folks who would disagree, but the most recent release of material related to the Warren Commission, which looked into JFK's assassination, I don't think there were a lot of bombshells there. I had a feeling that was going to be the case. One of the things, the reason some of those papers were withheld is because some of the people named in the documents were still alive. Particularly if you were an agent in Cuba or if you had any secretive connection to the CIA and you're still living, you know, one of the guarantees that intelligence agencies make is if you help us, we'll keep your identity anonymous. And so I think that's a good reason why some of these materials were withheld. But no, John, I did not see anything significant that's going to change my view that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed President Kennedy. Now, were there failures on the part of the FBI? Arguably, perhaps on the part of the CIA? Yes. Were they part of a conspiracy? Absolutely not. And if there was a cover-up of matters related to Kennedy's killing, it was a cover-up devoted to concealing Operation Mongoose, of making sure that our involvement in this effort that included assassination was not exposed. That was the main cover-up of the Warren Commission. They didn't touch that at all. And so, no, nothing new.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Steve Knott for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Steve, we hope you'll come back for another program, maybe your next book. What are you working on?
So I'm working on a book that should be out by this time next year on presidents and conspiracy theories.
So everything but Kennedy will be in that one.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Steve. We'll see you next, the 13th Presidential Executive Orders at the Union League, May 13th. There's a few books left. Please fill out the QR code or clip the QR code and give us your thoughts about tonight. We'd appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.